We know that there's a lot of stuff that's going on in Washington in particular that we're going to be watching this week, but let's go ahead and kind of take a step back at where we were in 2019, some of the significant things that happened here in Michigan that then we can look at might come into play in 2020. I'm going to start with you, Stephen.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the biggest story here in the state is the political story in Lansing, that we had a new governor and a new legislature, but still in the same control as before. And we're seeing that sort of new relationship play out. You know, how do they play together? Can they get along? Can they get things done? And I think there are a lot of question marks still at the end of the year. We didn't see that gel quite the way we thought it would. We didn't see as much production on some key issues as we might have wanted, but maybe 2020 and the new decade will bring, you know, legislative bliss to the Capitol.
Fresh start. What stood out in your mind for 2019, Nolan?
Well, a couple of things. I think first, I mean, we haven't talked about it in a while, but Dan Gilbert's stroke and sort of his disappearance from the scene, at least the public scene in Detroit. That happened on Memorial Day, and it's Christmas, and we really haven't seen him back engaged publicly. Understand he's recovering and going through therapy and all that, but in terms of the sort of everyday presence, big presence he was in Detroit, we haven't seen that. And it's hard for us to tell how that's played out with his company. What wasn't announced that might have been had Dan Gilbert still been healthy, engaged on a daily basis with his company.
What else?
Well, and that portends into the future too, right?
Yeah.
What is that going to look like in the near term?
In terms of investment for the city.
You have a lot of projects that they have announced or are already underway with that still need completion or planning. And I don't know, I mean, it does feel palpably different, the idea that the person who was driving all that is not there. And if that's going to continue, I think it'll end up looking really different.
What else?
Well, I think the UAW, both the strike we had in September, starting in September, first strike we've seen in a long time. It was a pretty good contract that the UAW was able to get after this 5-6 week strike. We got all 3 contracts settled now, but it was the first time we'd seen a company-wide strike in a while, and it did sort of change the dynamics that we'd seen in this industry for a couple of decades, where the UAW was sort of on its heels and the company was dictating the terms. I think that turned a little bit with this contract. Also with the UAW, the other major story I think we can't not talk about is that ongoing scandal, the corruption scandal. This is a union that hadn't been touched by corruption that we knew of in its history. It had a reputation of being a straight shooting union, and man, that corruption went right up the line, right into the president's office, very deep and widespread. And I suspect the union, the UAW, is going to end up under government's oversight before this is done.
Yeah, it really could.
One thing that kind of struck me as I was looking back at the year is the loss of a generational giants of leadership. Right. We lost John Dingell this year, and we lost Judge Damon Keith. And it always makes you think of...
And John Conyers.
And John Conyers. And Brooks Patterson. So you think about that kind of change, generational leadership change in this area, and how that will impact us kind of going forward, Stephen. What do you think?
I mean, in some ways it's sort of the second wave of that, I feel like, because we've had an advanced aged cadre of leadership for a while, and at first it was their retirements that we were all talking about, that they were all stepping away from the jobs they'd had for a long time and what impact that would have. But the loss of them as people, I think, is even bigger. The idea that they are not even there to influence the younger generation or to influence the politics that go on now.
Except for Brooks Patterson, who is still on the job when he died.
Well, he didn't retire, right.
And his death has absolutely changed the dynamics in Oakland County. It's a whole new leadership and a whole new governing philosophy now. Republican control has basically gone away. Democrats are in control of the county for the first time ever. And so you're seeing some real substantive changes. So you're seeing some real impact from Brooks's passing.
Yeah.
So you look at 2020 and going forward, and obviously everyone's looking at Washington and impeachment this week. And I want to kind of take a larger view question. We're hearing a lot of our congressional delegation coming out and explaining why they are voting the way they are voting and why they support or don't support things. Do you feel that that is necessary for people to understand the thought process, or does that change any minds? Or, I mean,
it's disingenuous because
you think it is?
Well, they can go through these long, elaborate explanations, come down to one simple answer, two simple answers. I support the president and oppose impeachment because I'm Republican. I oppose the president and support impeachment. Well, look at the vote. Look at the vote. There may be two or three defections.
Justin is the one who is the outlier.
An independent, yeah, but you've got 535 members of Congress, and maybe 2 or 3 or 4 will not vote on party lines. And it's a symptom, I think, of the blind partisanship in Washington and perhaps elsewhere. You support somebody because they're your guy, you oppose them because they're not, and vice versa.
The vote happens. What does this mean now for 2020? And we've got about a minute left. Well,
I mean, it sets the table for this contention to continue between Democrats in Congress and the president. And I think the hope, the political hope, was that that would set the table for the election, right? It set the tone for the election, this impeached president seeking a second term. I don't know that it'll play out that way. You never know. I mean, Democrats still have got to get their act together in terms of a candidate and cohesive message that will get Democrats to the polls better than they did in 2016. It's not about convincing Republican voters, it's getting their own voters to show up and say they want something different. Historically, though, of course, it matters that he will be the third impeached president.
Well, I write about this Sunday. I talked to our pollster. He has never seen a passion for voting among both Republicans and Democrats as he sees today, this far out from the election. I don't think it changed. This process has changed anybody's mind one way or the other, maybe on the margins. But for the most part, Republicans and Democratic voters had their mind made up going into this, and it hasn't changed.
Well, look out 2020, ready or not. Here we all come blasting through. Guys, it's good to see you. Merry Christmas. Happy New Year.
Absolutely.
All right.